hear that? They're calling. They're still here.
Are you sure you want to do this?
We've already gone too far.
Shit, something inside me.
Changing.
Specimens of life forms, mutated hosts, test subjects, have been turned into weapons.
Subject 13 has been activated. Repeat, the infected has mutated. Eliminate it immediately.
Nolan, don't run. You're next.
The desert wind howled against the chain-link fence, rattling the loose strands of barbed wire at the top. Nolan Carter crouched low in the sand, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. Jake knelt beside him, grinning despite the tension in the air. "This is so stupid," Nolan muttered, keeping his voice low. "That's what makes it fun," Jake shot back. "Come on, man, don't tell me you're scared." Nolan wasn't scared, not exactly, but something about the way the floodlights swept lazily across the compound ahead, the way the entire base felt abandoned yet somehow watched, it made his stomach twist. He exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said. "Let's do it." Jake tossed a rock at the fence. No response, no alarms, no soldiers charging out from the shadows. The place looked deserted. With practiced ease, he pulled a pair of wire cutters from his backpack and got to work. Within seconds, there was a gap big enough for them to squeeze through. Once inside, they kept low, weaving between rusted storage containers and long-forgotten vehicles. The structures ahead loomed like skeletons against the night sky, abandoned hangars, crumbling concrete bunkers, and a distant watchtower that looked like no one had set foot in it for years. But there was something else, too. A hum. Faint, almost imperceptible, but persistent. The sound vibrated beneath Nolan's ribs. "You hear that?" he whispered. Jake nodded. "Coming from over there." He pointed toward a sloping mound of earth, partially obscured by a tangle of dead brush. A massive steel hatch was embedded in the ground, its surface caked with sand. A keypad glowed faintly beside it. "No way we're getting in there," Nolan said. Jake smirked and pulled a stolen security keycard from his pocket. "Never underestimate my talents." Before Nolan could protest, Jake swiped the card. A mechanical clunk sounded from deep within the earth, followed by the slow, grinding groan of machinery. The hatch shuddered open, releasing a gust of cold, stale air that carried the unmistakable scent of decay. They hesitated. Nolan didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn around, to run. But then Jake switched on his flashlight and stepped forward, leaving Nolan with no choice but to follow. The tunnel sloped downward, lined with steel walls that dripped with condensation. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, some of them split open, leaking a thick, black substance that reeked of iron and rot. Their footsteps echoed in the suffocating silence. The deeper they went, the stronger the humming became. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was inside their heads, vibrating in their skulls like an insect burrowing beneath the skin. Then, the corridor opened into a massive chamber. The ceiling was impossibly high, lined with hanging chains and rusted hooks. Along the walls, Massive glass cylinders stood in neat rows, stretching into the shadows. At first, Nolan thought they were empty. But as he stepped closer, his breath hitched. There were bodies inside, humanoid figures suspended in a murky liquid, their features twisted in silent agony. Some of them were human, or at least they had been. Others were something else entirely. Their skin was slick and black, their limbs elongated and wrong, mouths where mouths shouldn't be, eyes that weren't eyes at all, but dark, swirling pits of nothingness. Jake cursed under his breath, stepping back so fast he nearly tripped. "What the hell is this?" Nolan whispered. A slow drip, drip, drip echoed through the chamber. Not water, something thicker, more viscous. And then they heard it, the sound of wet, ragged breathing. Nolan turned, his flashlight sweeping across the far end of the chamber. Something shifted in the darkness. A shape unfurled from the shadows, tall and hunched, its skin glistening and raw. It took a step forward, its elongated fingers curling against the steel floor, its movements unnatural, like its bones didn't fit together properly. Nolan and Jake froze. The thing tilted its head as if studying them. And then it moved. Not walked, moved. Its body twisted, flesh rippling like something trying to break free from inside. Its jaw unhinged, splitting wider and wider until the skin along its cheeks tore open, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth. Jake sucked in a sharp breath. Oh, shit. The thing lurched forward, impossibly fast. The boys turned and ran. Their footsteps thundered against the metal floor as they bolted down the corridor, the thing screeching behind them. It didn't sound like a scream. It sounded like bones scraping against metal, like meat being torn apart. Alarms suddenly blared overhead, red warning lights flashing along the walls. A metal door slammed shut ahead of them. A dead end. "No, no, no!" Jake shouted, slamming his fists against the steel. Nolan turned, his breath ragged. The thing skittered into view, its limbs bending at impossible angles. It paused, its chest heaving, a thick black secretion oozing from its mouth. And then, gunfire. A team of soldiers stormed in from a side corridor, their rifles blazing. The thing shrieked, its body convulsing as bullets ripped through it. But it didn't die. It changed. Its flesh bubbled and stretched, bones snapping and reforming. Its body split open, tendrils erupting from beneath the skin, latching onto the nearest soldier. His scream was brief and wet, cut off as his spine twisted unnaturally, his body folding inward as if being sucked into itself. The soldiers panicked, shouting orders, their bullets doing nothing. Nolan grabbed Jake and ran for the exit, shoving past the chaos. The hallway blurred around them as the sounds of screaming, gunfire, and wet, organic tearing filled the air. They burst through the open hatch into the cold desert night, lungs burning. Behind them, the facility erupted into chaos, red warning lights flashing against the sand, soldiers shouting orders, the thing screeching like metal being ripped apart. Then, silence. Jake staggered forward, clutching his side. "I think..." He swayed. "I think it got me." Nolan turned the flashlight on him. His shirt was torn, his skin split open in deep gashes. But it wasn't blood that leaked from the wounds. It was black, thick, pulsing. Something moved beneath the surface. Jake lifted his hand, staring at his fingers as they trembled and stretched, the bones inside shifting. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, he whispered, "Nolan, something's inside me." Nolan barely remembered driving back to town. His hands were still shaking as he gripped the wheel, his mind playing back the scene underground, the grotesque shifting thing in the darkness, the shrieks of soldiers as their bodies were pulled apart, the glistening tendrils burrowing into their flesh like parasites. And then there was Jake. He sat in the passenger seat, slumped against the window, his breathing shallow. He hadn't said a word since they escaped. The gashes across his torso were no longer bleeding, not in the normal way. Black, syrupy fluid oozed from his wounds, thick and slow, pulsing like something was alive beneath his skin. Nolan swallowed hard. "We're almost at your place, okay?" Jake didn't answer. The drive through Rachel was eerily quiet, the small desert town asleep under the glow of flickering streetlights. Nolan pulled up to Jake's trailer, glancing around to make sure no one was watching before hurrying to the passenger side. "Come on, man. Help me out here." Jake stirred, his eyes flickering open. For a second, Nolan thought he saw something wrong in them, like his pupils weren't quite circular anymore, the blackness stretching outward, warping. But then Jake blinked and they looked normal again. "I got you," Nolan said, pulling Jake's arm over his shoulder and half carrying him toward the trailer. The second they got inside, Jake collapsed onto the couch, groaning. Nolan flicked on the kitchen light. "Okay, let me see it." Jake hesitated before peeling his shredded shirt away. Nolan's stomach twisted. The wounds had changed. They weren't just gashes anymore. The edges were darker, the skin around them tight and glossy, like a second layer was forming underneath. Inside the wounds, beneath the skin, something moved, small, twitching tendrils, curling and uncurling like they were testing their surroundings. Nolan took a step back. Jake let out a shaky breath. It doesn't hurt, not like before." His voice was quieter, almost distorted. "You need a doctor, man." Jake shook his head violently. "No doctors, no hospitals." He looked up, his eyes too dark, too deep. "You know what they'll do to me if they find out." Nolan hesitated. He did know. He saw what the government did in that facility. They wouldn't help Jake. They'd lock him away in one of those tanks, let him mutate into something unspeakable, just like the others. A sudden buzzing sound filled the room. Nolan's phone. He pulled it from his pocket. The screen flickered, static crackling across the display, distorting the time and notifications. And then, a voice, faint, warped, barely more than a whisper, but it was there. "Help us." Nolan's breath hitched. "What the hell?" Jake sat up suddenly. "You hear it too?" "You heard that?" Jake nodded slowly. "It's in my head, since we left." His hands trembled as he rubbed his temples. "I keep seeing things, Nolan. I close my eyes and I see faces. Not human. Not fully. Like they're waiting." The phone glitched again, more static. A distorted voice came through, its words fragmented. "The government took us, trapped, underground." Jake shuddered. His veins darkened, the black infection pulsing through them like liquid mercury. Then his entire body convulsed, his back arched, his breath hitching in his throat as his fingers stretched, the bones elongating for a split second before snapping back. His skin rippled, muscles twitching as if they were trying to rearrange themselves beneath the surface. Nolan grabbed his arm. Jake. Jake let out a strangled gasp, his body trembling violently. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room fell silent. Jake's breathing slowed. He looked up, his pupils dilating in the dim light. "It's getting worse." Nolan swallowed hard. There was no stopping it. Jake was changing. They had to find out what the government did to those creatures in that facility. They had to fix this before Jake became something he couldn't come back from. But before Nolan could say anything, there was a loud knock at the door. Both of them froze. Another knock. Harder, more urgent. Nolan crept toward the window and peered through the blinds. Outside, standing beneath the flickering porch light, was a woman. She wasn't military. She wasn't in uniform. But there was something about her presence that sent a chill through Nolan's spine. She knew. She knew what had happened to them. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, down the street, black SUVs idled, their engines running. Jake gripped the couch, his breathing shallow. "We have to go. Now." Nolan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Jake's arm, helped him up, and they slipped out the back door, just as the woman outside whispered, "I know you're in there." The desert night swallowed them as Nolan and Jake slipped out the back door, their footsteps crunching softly against the dry earth. The woman's voice echoed in their heads, a calm, deliberate threat masked as an invitation. "I know you're in there." Nolan barely dared to breathe. He could see the silhouettes of men moving near the SUVs, shifting through the darkness like shadows. Whoever they weren't ordinary law enforcement. Jake stumbled beside him, his body convulsing as another wave of unnatural spasms overtook him. Nolan barely managed to keep him upright as they weaved between the skeletal remains of old trailers, moving farther from the trailer park and deeper into the vast emptiness of the desert. "Hold on, man," Nolan whispered, trying to keep the panic from his voice. Jake let out a strangled breath. "It's getting worse." Nolan didn't need him to say it. He could see it. The black veins had spread, reaching up Jake's neck, snaking toward his jawline. His skin no longer looked entirely human. It had taken on a strange, translucent sheen, like something beneath it was shifting, trying to break free. The memory of the facility clawed at Nolan's mind, the writhing bodies in the tanks, their flesh morphing into something alien and grotesque. Was Jake becoming one of them? The thought sent ice through Nolan's veins. They needed answers. Fast. Dr. Evelyn Crane. The name had appeared in the static-laced messages from his phone, the distorted voice whispering secrets through the interference. She was inside that facility, trapped, and if anyone knew how to stop this, it was her. But getting back into Area 51 meant getting past the people hunting them now. A sharp click cut through the silence. Nolan barely had time to react before a dart hissed through the air and embedded itself into Jake's shoulder. Jake let out a grunt of pain, staggering. His hands shot up to yank the dart free, but before he could, his entire body seized. His spine arched unnaturally, his muscles locking up, his mouth opening in a soundless scream. Panic surged through Nolan. "Jake!" Jake's eyes rolled back into his skull, his limbs convulsing violently as he collapsed to the ground. A voice spoke from the darkness. "I was hoping you'd run." Nolan whipped around. The woman from the trailer stood just a few feet away, flanked by two men in black tactical gear, their weapons raised. Up close, she was wrong. Too still, too composed, her face expressionless despite the chaos around her. The way she watched Jake's twitching body was clinical, detached, like she had seen this before, like she had caused it. Nolan's fists clenched. "Who the hell are you?" The woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Your friend is in the final stage now." She tilted her head, studying Jake's shaking form. "I'd say you have about an hour before he's unrecognizable." Nolan's blood turned to ice. "What did you do to him?" "We didn't do anything," the woman said, tucking her hands into her long coat. "He was already compromised the moment he stepped into that facility." Jake let out a ragged, inhuman gasp. Nolan looked down. His skin was shifting. The flesh along his arms rippled as if something beneath it was moving. His fingers twitched violently, the bones inside audibly cracking as they lengthened, stretched. His breathing turned erratic, his chest heaving with unnatural force. And then, his jaw distended. The skin of his cheeks split open with a sickening wet sound, revealing a second row of jagged, glistening teeth beneath the first. Nolan took a staggering step back. "Jake!" Jake's head snapped toward him, but his eyes, they were gone. His pupils had ruptured, replaced by shifting black voids, spiraling and ever-expanding, as if looking at something beyond human comprehension. And then he screamed. Not a human scream, a sound that belonged to something else. The men in tactical gear raised their weapons. "Get back, now!" one of them barked. The woman, however, was calm. "Fascinating," she murmured. Jake lunged. His body moved in a blur of contorted limbs and twisting flesh, his bones snapping and reforming mid-motion, his arms stretching, bending in ways that should have been impossible. Clawed fingers, longer now, almost talon-like, ripped through the nearest soldier's throat before he could even react. The soldier gurgled, his eyes wide as his body was pulled apart, his organs spilling onto the sand. Nolan barely had time to process before gunfire erupted. Bullets tore into Jake's body, but they didn't slow him down. If anything, they made him angrier. His flesh rippled, absorbing the impact, and then he changed again. A second set of arms erupted from his sides, his spine elongated, twisting his posture into something no longer remotely human. He turned his head, his skin peeling back to reveal something pulsating beneath. And then he was on them. Another soldier screamed as Jake's tendrils wrapped around his body, constricting, crushing, until his ribs splintered through his flesh like broken twigs. The woman remained still, watching, unfazed, but Nolan couldn't stay. His best friend was gone, or worse, something else was wearing his skin. With his pulse pounding in his ears, he turned and ran. The gunfire continued behind him, but it was useless. Jake wasn't human anymore. Nolan sprinted through the desert, the cold air biting his skin, his mind screaming at him to wake up from this nightmare. But this was real. Jake was mutating. And if he didn't find Dr. Evelyn Crane soon, there'd be nothing left of his best friend to save. Nolan's legs burned as he ran, his breath tearing through his throat like fire. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast empty wasteland beneath the indifferent glow of the moon. Behind him, the screams had stopped. That was worse than the gunfire. Silence meant only one thing. Jake had finished with them. The black SUVs sat abandoned near the trailer park, the headlights still glowing weakly. Their drivers were either dead or had fled into the night, knowing that whatever was inside his best friend was no longer human enough to be stopped by bullets. Nolan stumbled toward the nearest vehicle, flung open the door, and yanked himself inside. His hands trembled as he shoved the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the dust as he slammed his foot on the gas. Area 51 was the only place left to go. Dr. Evelyn Crane was still down there, buried beneath miles of steel and concrete. If anyone could fix this, if there was any chance of saving Jake, it was her. But deep down, a cold, unshakable truth gnawed at his chest. What if Jake was already beyond saving? The facility loomed ahead, a dark scar on the desert's skin. The gates had been forced open, not by an explosion, but by something much worse. The entrance tunnel had collapsed, walls torn apart like aluminum foil, the steel peeled back in long, jagged strips. Jake had already been here. Nolan clenched the wheel, his heart slamming against his ribs. He had to be faster. The underground facility was eerily quiet when he made it inside. Dim red emergency lights pulsed along the ceiling, flickering weakly. The air reeked of burnt metal and blood. Nolan moved carefully, gripping the stolen handgun he'd pulled from the SUV. Not that it would matter. He'd seen what Jake had become, but it made him feel less helpless. A wet sound echoed from deeper inside, a sound like flesh shifting over itself, sliding, stretching. Nolan's stomach turned. He knew what that meant. Jake was here, a distant metallic creak followed by a heavy drip. Drip, drip. Nolan turned the corner and nearly vomited. The hallway was painted in human remains. The Black Ops soldiers who had been stationed inside were no longer recognizable as people. Their bodies had been torn open, hollowed out, their organs spilled across the floor in wet heaps. Some were hanging from the ceiling, fused into the pipes, their mouths still moving, whispering garbled, inhuman words. And at the end of the corridor, a figure crouched in the carnage. Jake, or what was left of him. His body had fully transformed, his limbs elongated, stretched grotesquely. A second row of jagged arms sprouting from his ribs. His face was split down the middle, his lower jaw hanging loose, rows of needle-thin teeth glistening with fresh blood. His skin was a sickening mix of translucent flesh and something darker, shifting, pulsing with a life of its own. He was feeding. Nolan swallowed, fighting down the bile rising in his throat. Jake twitched, then he turned his head. The movement was too fast, too unnatural. His eyes, if they could still be called that, were endless black voids, swirling, twisting. And yet, somewhere in that monstrous face, Nolan swore he saw something else. Recognition. Nolan. The voice was barely more than a whisper. It shouldn't have been possible, not with a mouth like that. But somehow it was. Jake took a step forward. Nolan raised the gun. "Jake, stop!" The thing wearing his best friend's skin tilted its head. "Don't leave me." The words came in layers, as if a dozen voices were speaking at once. Some human, some not. Nolan's chest clenched painfully. He wanted to believe Jake was still in there, but then Jake moved again. Not a step, a lunge. Nolan barely had time to react before a clawed hand slashed across the space between them. He stumbled backward, feeling the air ripple as razor-thin talons sliced inches from his face. There was nothing human left in that attack. Nolan's grip tightened on the gun. He didn't want to do this, but he had no choice. The door to the deep lab was behind him. He just needed to get past Jake, get to Crane, get the cure, if there was one. Jake's mouth split open wider, tendrils slithering from his throat, reaching. Nolan pulled the trigger. The gunshot rang out like thunder. Jake jerked back, a hole ripped through his chest, but he didn't fall. Instead, he laughed, or at least something inside him did. A sound that was not human, a sound that was not Jake. And then he charged. Nolan barely had time to dodge. The wall exploded behind him as Jake's body smashed through it like tissue paper, sending debris flying. Nolan rolled, scrambled to his feet, and sprinted down the hall. The lab was just ahead. The door was open. Inside, Dr. Evelyn Crane stood, her coat soaked in blood, her face unreadable. Behind her, a massive containment pod glowed with an eerie blue light. "You made it," she said. "Fix him," Nolan gasped, pointing toward the monstrous shape clawing its way through the ruined hallway. "Fix him now." Dr. Crane's expression was empty. "I can't." Nolan's blood ran cold. "What?" She stepped aside, revealing the glowing pod. Inside was another Jake, except this one wasn't mutated. This one was human. "That thing in the hallway isn't your friend," Crane said quietly. "It never was." Nolan felt the world shatter. The truth crashed over him like a wave of ice. Jake had died in the facility that night. The creature wearing his face had only been borrowing his body, and now it wanted a new one. The monstrous thing that had once been Jake roared, charging forward. Dr. Crane slammed a button. The containment pod opened. Nolan barely had time to react before a new voice filled his head. "Run!" And then darkness swallowed everything. The last thing he saw was Jake's body splitting apart, flesh unraveling like ribbons, reaching for him. And then the world ended.